friends and cohorts, welcome back once again. And today we are here for part 6, reading The Power of the Powerless. And I will do a very short introduction. If you watched part 5, you already know why that's a short introduction. And I did want to say one thing. I had a really great opportunity this last weekend to see Ann Vandersteel speak in Springfield, Oregon. It was a really a great get together of state nationals, and it was really nice to see our movement growing. So I kind of doubt that anybody from our group will see this, but if any of you are watching this, what an exciting time. Thank you so much for coming to the event. And when you're ready to get your paperwork started, if you haven't already, remember, I can help you. I am a notary. So I will leave that there, and I hope that you enjoy part 6, reading Power of the Powerless. I'll see you next time. Chapter 16. The post-totalitarian system is mounting a total assault on humans, and humans stand against it alone, abandoned and isolated. It is therefore entirely natural that all the dissident movements are explicitly defensive movements. They exist to defend human beings and the genuine aims of life against the aims of the system. Today, the Polish group KOR is called the Committee for Social Self-Defense. The word defense appears in the names of other similar groups in Poland, but even the Soviet Helsinki Monitoring Group in our own Charter 77 are clearly defensive in nature. In terms of traditional politics, this program of defense is understandable, even though it may appear minimal, provisional, and ultimately negative. It offers no new conception, model, or ideology, and therefore it is not politics in the proper sense of the word, since politics always assumes a positive program and can scarcely limit itself to defending someone against something. Such a view, I think, reveals the limitations of the traditionally political way of looking at things. The post-totalitarian system, after all, is not manifestation of a particular political line followed by a particular government. It is something radically different. It is a complex, profound, and long-term violation of society, or rather, the self-violation of society. To oppose it merely by establishing a different political line and then striving for a challenge in government would not only be unrealistic, it would be utterly inadequate, for it would never come near to touching the root of the matter. For some time now, the problem has no longer resided in a political line or program. It is a problem of life itself. Thus, defending the aims of life, defending humanity, is not only a more realistic approach, since it can begin right now and is potentially more popular because it concerns people's everyday lives. At the same time, and perhaps precisely because of this, it is also an incomparably more consistent approach because it aims at the very essence of things. There are times when we must sink to the bottom of our misery to understand truth, just as we must ascend to the bottom of a well to see the stars in broad daylight. It seems to me that today, this provisional, minimal, and negative program, the simple defense of people, is in a particular sense, and not merely in the circumstances in which we live, an optimal and more positive program because it forces politics to return to its only proper starting point. Proper, that is, if all the old mistakes are to be avoided. Individual people. In democratic societies where the violence done to human beings is not nearly so obvious and cruel, this fundamental revolution in politics has yet to happen. And some things will probably have to get worse before the urgent need for that revolution is reflected in politics. In our world, precisely because of the misery in which we find ourselves, it would seem that politics has already undergone that transformation. The central concern of political thought is no longer abstract visions of a self-redeeming, positive model, and of course the opportunistic political practice that are the reverse of the same coin, but rather the people who have so far merely been enslaved by those models and their practices. Every society, of course, requires some degree of organization. Yet, if that organization is to serve people and not the other way around, then people will have to be liberated and space created so that they may organize themselves in meaningful ways. The depravity of the opposite approach, in which people are first organized in one way or another by someone who always knows best what the people need, so they may then allegedly be liberated, is something we have known on our own skins only too well. To sum it up, most people who are too bound to the traditional political way of thinking see the weaknesses of the dissident movements in their purely defensive character. In contrast, I see that as their greatest strength. I believe that this is precisely where those movements supersede the kind of politics from whose point of view their program can seem so inadequate. Chapter 17. In the dissident movements of the Soviet bloc, the defense of human beings usually takes the form of a defense of human and civil rights as they are entrenched in various official documents, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenants on Human Rights, the final act of the Helsinki Conference, and the constitutions of individual states. These movements set out to defend anyone who is being prosecuted for acting in the spirit of those rights, and they in turn act in the same spirit in their work by insisting over and over again that the regime recognize and respect human and civil rights, and by drawing attention to the areas of life where this is not the case. Their work, therefore, is based on the principle of legality. They operate publicly and openly, insisting not only that their activity is in line with the law, but that achieving respect for the law is one of their main aims. The principle of legality, which provides both the point of departure and the framework for their activities, is common to all dissident groups in the Soviet bloc. Even though individual groups have never worked out any formal agreement on that point, the circumstance raises an important question. Why, in conditions where a widespread and arbitrary abuse of power is the rule, is there such a general and spontaneous acceptance of the principle of legality? On the primary level, this stress on legality is a natural expression of specific conditions that exist in a post-totalitarian system and a consequence of an elementary understanding of that specificity. If there are, in essence, only two ways to struggle for a free society, that is, through legal means and through armed or unarmed revolt, then it should be obvious at once how inappropriate the latter alternative is in a post-totalitarian system. Revolt is appropriate when conditions are clearly and openly in motion during a war, for example, or in situations where social or political conflicts are coming to a head. It is appropriate in a classical dictatorship that is either just setting itself up or is in a state of collapse. In other words, it is appropriate where social forces of comparable strength, for example, a government of occupation versus a nation fighting for its freedom, are confronting each other on the level of actual power, or where there is a clear distinction between the usurpers of power and the subjugated population, or when society finds itself in a state of open crisis. Conditions in the post-totalitarian system, except in extremely explosive situations like the one in Hungary in 1956, are of course precisely the opposite. They are static and stable, and social crises, for the most part, exist only latently, although they run much deeper. Society is not sharply polarized on the level of actual political power, but as we have seen, the fundamental lines of conflict run right through each person. In this situation, no attempt at revolt could ever hope to set up even a minimum of resonance in the rest of society, because that society is so horrific, submerged in a consumer rat race, and wholly involved in the post-totalitarian system, that is, participating in it and acting as agents of its automatism. And it would simply find anything like a revolt unacceptable. It would interpret the revolt as an attack upon itself, and rather than supporting the revolt, it would very probably react by intensifying its bias towards the system, since, in its view, the system can at least guarantee a certain quasi-legality. Add to this the fact that the post-totalitarian system has at its disposal a complex mechanism of direct and indirect surveillance that has no equal in history, and it is clear that not only would any attempt to revolt come to a dead end politically, but it would also be almost technically impossible to carry off. Most probably, it would be liquidated before it had a chance to translate its intentions into action. Even if revolt were possible, however, it would remain the solitary gesture of a few isolated individuals, and they would be oppressed not only by a gigantic apparatus of national and supranational power, but also by the very society in whose name they were mounting their revolt in the first place. This, by the way, is another reason why the regime and its propaganda have been ascribing terroristic aims to the dissident movements and accusing them of illegal and conspiratorial methods. All of this, however, is not the main reason why the dissident movements support the principle of legality. That reason lies deeper in the innermost structure of the dissident attitude. This attitude is and must be fundamentally hostile towards the notion of violent change as such to the system, and every revolt essentially aims at violent change simply because it places its faith in violence. Generally, the dissident attitude can only accept violence as a necessary evil in extreme situations, when direct violence can only be met by violence, and where remaining passive when in effect means supporting violence. Let us recall, for example, that the blindness of European pacifism was one of the factors that prepared the ground for the Second World War. As I have already mentioned, dissidents tend to be skeptical about political thought based on the faith that profound social changes can only be achieved by bringing about, regardless of the method, changes in the system or in the government, and the belief that such changes, because they are considered fundamental, justify the sacrifice of the less fundamental things. In other words, human lives. Respect for a theoretical concept here overweighs respect for human life. Yet this is precisely what threatens to enslave humanity all over again. Dissident movements, as I have tried to indicate, share exactly the opposite view. They understand systematic change as something superficial, something secondary, something that in itself can guarantee nothing. Thus, an attitude that turns away from abstract political visions of the future towards concrete human beings and ways of defending them effectively in the here and now is quite naturally accompanied by an intensified antipathy to all forms of violence carried out in the name of a better future, and by a profound belief that a future secured by violence might actually be worse than what exists now. In other words, the future would be fatally stigmatized by the very means used to secure it. At the same time, this attitude is not to be mistaken for political conservatism or political moderation. The dissident movements do not shy away from the idea of violent political overthrow because the idea seems too radical, but on the contrary, because it does not seem radical enough. For them, the problem lies far too deep to be settled through mere systematic changes, either governmental or technological. Some people, faithful to the classical Marxist doctrines of the 19th century, understand our system as the hegemony of any exploiting class over an exploiting class, and operating from the postulate that exploiters never surrender their power voluntarily, they see the only solution in a revolution to sweep away the exploiters. Naturally, they regard such things as the struggle for human rights as something hopelessly legalistic, illusory, opportunistic, and ultimately misleading because it makes the doubtful assumption that you can negotiate in good faith with your exploiters on the basis of a false legality. The problem is that they are unable to find anyone determined enough to carry out this revolution, with the result that they become bitter, skeptical, passive, and ultimately apathetic. In other words, they end up precisely where the system wants them to be. This is one example of how far one can be misled by mechanically applying, in post-totalitarian circumstances, ideological models from another world and another time. Of course, one need be an advocate of violent revolution to ask whether an appeal to legality makes any sense at all when the laws, and particularly the general laws concerning human rights, are no more than a facade, an aspect of the world of appearances, a mere game behind which lies total manipulation. They can ratify anything because they will still go ahead and do whatever they want anyway. This is an opinion we often encounter. Is it not true that to constantly take them at their word, to appeal to laws every child knows are binding only as long as the government wishes, is in the end just a kind of hypocrisy, a Veshkian obstructionism, and finally, just another way of playing the game, another form of self-delusion? In other words, is the legalistic approach at all comparable with the principle of living within the truth? This question can only be answered by first looking at the wider implications of how the legal code functions in the post-totalitarian system. In a classical dictatorship, to a far greater extent than in the post-totalitarian system, the will of the ruler is carried out directly, in an unregulated fashion. A dictatorship has no reason to hide its foundations, nor to conceal the real workings of power, and therefore it need not encumber itself to any great extent with a legal code. The post-totalitarian system, on the other hand, is utterly obsessed with the need to bind everything in single order. Life in such a state is thoroughly permeated by a dense network of regulations, proclamations, directives, norms, orders, and rules. It is not called a bureaucratic system without good reason. A large proportion of those norms functions as direct instruments of the complex manipulation of life that is intrinsic to the post-totalitarian system. Individuals are reduced to little more than tiny cogs in an enormous mechanism, and their significance is limited to their function in this mechanism. Their job, housing accommodations, movements, social and cultural expressions, everything, in short, must be cosseted together as firmly as possible, predetermined, regulated, and controlled. Every aberration from the prescribed course of life is treated as error, license, and anarchy. From the cook in the restaurant who, without hard to get permission from the bureaucratic apparatus, cannot cook something special for his customers, to the singer who cannot perform his new song at a concert without bureaucratic approval, everyone in all aspects of their life is caught in this regulatory tangle of red tape, the inevitable product of the post-totalitarian system. With ever-increasing consistency, it binds all the expression and aims of life to the spirit of its own aims, the vested interests of its own smooth, automatic operation. In a narrower sense, The legal code serves the post-totalitarian system in this direct way as well. That is, it too forms a part of the world of regulations and prohibitions. At the same time, however, it performs the same service in another indirect way, one that brings it remarkably closer, depending on which level of the law is involved, to ideology, and in some cases, making it a direct component of that ideology. 1. Like ideology, the legal code functions as an excuse. It wraps the base exercise of power in the noble apparel of the letter of the law. It creates the pleasing illusion that justice is done, society protected, and the exercise of power objectively regulated. All this is done to conceal the real essence of post-totalitarian legal practice, the total manipulation of society. If an outside observer who knew nothing at all about life in Czechoslovakia were to study only its laws, he or she would be utterly incapable of understanding what we were complaining about. The hidden political manipulation of the courts and public prosecutors, the limitations placed on lawyers' ability to defend their clients, the closed nature, de facto, of trials, the arbitrary actions of the security forces, their position of authority over the judiciary, the absurdly broad application of several deliberately vague sections of that code, and of course, the state's utter disregard for the positive sections of that code, the rights of citizens. All of this would remain hidden from our outside observer. The only thing he or she would take away would be the impression that our legal code is not much worse than the legal code of other civilized countries, and not much different either, except perhaps for certain curiosities, such as the entrenchment in the Constitution of a single political party's eternal rule and the state's love for a neighboring superpower. But that is not all. If our observer had the opportunity to study the formal side of policing and judicial procedures and practices, how they look on paper, he or she would discover that for the most part, the common rules of criminal procedure are observed. Charges are laid within the prescribed period following arrest, and it is the same with detention orders. Indictments are properly delivered, the accused has a lawyer, and so on. In other words, everyone has an excuse. They have all observed the law. In reality, however, they have cruelly and pointlessly ruined a young person's life, perhaps for no other reason than because he or she made a samizdat copies of a novel written by a banned writer, or because the police deliberately falsified their testimony, as everyone knows from the judge on down to the defendant. Yet all of this somehow remains in the background. The falsified testimony is not necessarily obvious from the trial documents, and the section of the criminal code dealing with incitement does not formally exclude the application of that charge to the copying of a banned novel. In other words, the legal code, at least in several areas, is not more than a facade, an aspect of the world of appearances. Then why is it there at all? For exactly the same reason as ideology is there. It provides a bridge of excuses between the system and individuals, making it easier for them to enter the power structure and serve the arbitrary demands of power. The excuse lets individuals fool themselves into thinking they are merely upholding the law and protecting society from criminals. Without this excuse, how much more difficult it would be to recruit new generations of judges, prosecutors, and interrogators. As an aspect of the world of appearances, however, the legal code deceives not only the conscience of prosecutors, it deceives the public, it deceives foreign observers, and it even deceives history itself. 2. Like ideology, the legal code is an essential instrument of ritual communication outside the power structure. It is the legal code that gives the exercise of power a form, a framework, a set of rules. It is the legal code that enables all components of the system to communicate, to put themselves in a good light, to establish their own legitimacy. It proves their whole game with its rules and engineers and their technology. Can the exercise of post-totalitarian powers be imagined at all without this universal ritual making it all possible, serving as a common language to bind the relevant sectors of power structures together? The more important the position occupied by the repressive apparatus in the power structure, the more important that it functions according to some kind of formal code. How, otherwise, could people be so easily and inconspicuously looked up for copying banned books if there were no judges, prosecutors, interrogators, defense lawyers, court stenographers, and thick files, and if all this were not held together by some firm order? And above all, without that innocent-looking Section 100 on incitement. This could all be done, of course, without a legal code and its accessories, but only in some ephemeral dictatorship run by a Ugandan bandit, not in a system that embraces such a huge portion of civilized humankind and represents an integral, stable, and respected part of the modern world. That would not only be unthinkable, it would quite simply be technically impossible without the legal code functioning as a ritually cohesive force. The post-totalitarian system could not exist. The entire role of ritual, facades, and accusers appears most eloquently, of course, not in the proscriptive sections of the legal code, which sets out what a citizen may not do and what the grounds for prosecution are, but in the section declaring what he or she may do and what his or her rights are. Here there is truly nothing but words, words, words. Yet even that part of the code is of immense importance to the system, for it is here that the system establishes its legitimacy as a whole, before its own citizens, before school children, before international public, and before history. The system cannot afford to disregard this because it cannot permit itself to cast doubt upon the fundamental postulates of its ideology, which are so essential to its very existence. We have already seen how the power structure is enslaved by its own ideology and its ideological prestige. To do this would be to deny everything it tries to present itself as, and thus one of the main pillars on which the system rests would be undermined: the integrity of the world of appearances. If the exercise of power circulates through the whole power structure as blood flows through veins, then the legal code can be understood as something that reinforces the walls of those veins. Without it, the blood of power could not circulate in an organized way, and the body of society would hemorrhage at random. Order would collapse. A persistent and never-ending appeal to the laws, not just to the laws concerning human rights, but to all laws, does not mean at all that those who do so have succumbed to the illusion that in our system the law is anything other than what it is. They are well aware of the role it plays, but precisely because they know how desperately the system depends on it, on the noble version of the law that is, they also know how enormously significant such appeals are, because the system cannot do without the law, because it is hopelessly tied down by the necessity of pretending the laws are observed. It is compelled to react in some way to such appeals. Demanding that the laws be upheld is thus an act of living within the truth that threatens the whole mendacious structure at its point of maximum mendacity. Over and over again, such appeals make the purely ritualistic nature of the law clear to society and to those who inhabit its power structure. They draw attention to its real material substance and thus indirectly compel all those who take refuge behind the law to affirm and make credible this agency of excuses, this means of communication, this reinforcement of the social arteries outside of which their will could not be made to circulate through society. They are compelled to do so for the sake of their own conscience, for the impression they make on outsiders, to maintain themselves in power as part of the system's own mechanism of self-preservation and its principles of cohesion, or simply out of fear that they will be reproached for being clumsy in handling the ritual. They have no other choice because they cannot discard the rules of their own game. They can only attend more carefully to those rules. Not to react to challenges means to undermine their own excuse and lose control of their mutual communications system. To assume that the laws are a mere facade, that they have no validity, and that therefore it is pointless to appeal to them, would mean to go on reinforcing those aspects of the law that create the facade and the ritual. It would mean confirming the law as an aspect of the world of appearances and enabling those who exploit it to rest easy with the cheapest and therefore the most mendacious form of their excuse. I have frequently witnessed policemen, prosecutors, or judges, if they were dealing with an experienced chartist or a courageous lawyer, and if they were exposed to public attention as individuals with a name no longer protected by the anonymity of the apparatus, suddenly and anxiously begin to take particular care that no cracks appear in the ritual. This does not alter the fact that a despotic power is hiding behind that ritual, but the very existence of the official's anxiety necessarily regulates, limits, and slows down the operation of that despotism. This, of course, is not enough, but an essential part of the dissident attitude is that it comes out of the reality of the human here and now. It places more importance on oft-repeated and consistent concrete action, even though it may be inadequate and though it may ease only significantly the suffering of a single insignificant citizen, than it does in some abstract fundamental solution in an uncertain future. In any case, is not this, in fact, just another form of small-scale work in the Mazarician sense, with which the dissident attitude seemed at first to be in such sharp contradiction? This section would be incomplete without stressing certain internal limitations to the policy of taking them at their word. The point is this: even in the most ideal of cases, the law is only one of several imperfect and more or less external ways of defending what is better in life against what is worse. By itself, the law can never create anything better. Its purpose is to render a service, and its meaning does not lie in the law itself. Establishing respect for the law does not automatically ensure a better life for that, after all, is a job for people and not for laws and institutions. It is possible to imagine a society with good laws that are fully respected, but in which it is impossible to live. Conversely, one can imagine life being quite bearable even where the laws are imperfect and imperfectly applied. The most important thing is always the quality of that life, and whether or not the laws enhance life or repress it, not merely whether they are upheld or not. Often strict observance of the law could have a disastrous impact on human dignity. The key to a humane, dignified, rich, and happy life does not lie either in the Constitution or in the criminal code. These merely establish what may or may not be done, and thus they can make life easier or more difficult. They limit or permit. They punish, tolerate, or defend, but they can never give life substance or meaning. The struggle for what is called legality must constantly keep this legality in perspective against the background of life as it really is. Without keeping one's eyes open to the real dimensions of life's beauty and misery, and without a moral relationship to life, this struggle will sooner or later come to grief on the rocks of some self-justifying system of scholastics. Without really wanting to, one would thus become more and more like the observer who comes to conclusions about our system only on the basis of trial documents and is satisfied if all the appropriate regulations have been observed. Chapter 18. If the basic job of the dissident movements is to serve truth, that is, to serve the real aims of life, and if that necessarily develops into a defense of the individual and his or her rights to a free and truthful life, that is, a defense of human rights and a struggle to see the laws respected, then another stage of this approach, perhaps the most mature stage so far, is what Vaclav Benda has called the development of parallel structures. When those who have decided to live within the truth have been denied any direct influence on the existing social structures, not to mention the opportunity to participate in them, and when these people begin to create what I have called the independent life of society, this independent life begins of itself to become structured in a certain way. Sometimes there are only very embryonic indications of this process of structuring. At other times, the structures are already quite well developed. Their genesis and evolution are inseparable from the phenomenon of descent, even though they reach far beyond the arbitrary defined area of activity usually indicated by that term. What are these structures? Ivan Giras was the first in Czechoslovakia to formulate and apply in practice the concept of a second culture. Although at first he was thinking chiefly of nonconformist rock music and only certain literary, artistic, or performance events close to the sensibilities of those nonconformist musical groups, the term second culture very rapidly came to be used for the whole area of independent and repressed culture, that is, not only for art in its various currents, but also for the humanities, the social sciences, and philosophical thought. This second culture, quite naturally, has created elementary organizational forms. Samizdat editions of books and magazines, private performances and concerts, seminars, exhibitions, and so on. In Poland, all of this is vastly more developed. There are independent publishing houses and many more periodicals, even political periodicals. They have means of proliferation other than carbon copies and so on. In the Soviet Union, Samizdat has a longer tradition, and clearly its forms are quite different. Culture, therefore, is a sphere in which the parallel structures can be observed in their most highly developed form. Benda, of course, gives thought to potential or embryonic forms of such structures in other spheres as well, from a parallel information network to parallel forms of education, private universities, parallel trade unions, parallel foreign contacts, to a kind of hypothesis on a parallel economy. On the basis of these parallel structures, he then develops the notion of a parallel polis, or state, or rather, he sees the rudiments of such a polis in these structures. At a certain stage in its development, the independent life of society and the dissident movements cannot avoid a certain amount of organization and institutionalization. This is a natural development, and unless this independent life of society is somehow radically suppressed and eliminated, the tendency will grow. Along with it, a parallel political life will also necessarily evolve, and to a certain extent, it exists already in Czechoslovakia. Various groupings of a more or less political nature will continue to define themselves politically, to act and confront each other. These parallel structures, it may be said, represent the most articulate expression so far of living within the truth. One of the most important tasks the dissident movements have set themselves is to support and develop them. Once again, it confirms the fact that all attempts by society to resist pressure of the system have their essential beginnings in the pre-political area. For what else are parallel structures than an area where a different life can be lived, a life that is in harmony with its own aims and which in turn structures itself in harmony with those aims. What else are those initial attempts at social self-organization than the efforts of a certain part of society to live as a society within the truth, to rid itself of self-sustaining aspects of totalitarianism and thus to extricate itself radically from its involvement in the post-totalitarian system? What else is it but a non-violent attempt by people to negate this system within themselves and to establish their lives on a new basis, that of their own proper identity? And does this tendency not confirm once more the principle of returning the focus to actual individuals? After all, the parallel structures do not grow a priori out of a theoretical vision of systematic changes. There are no political sects involved, but from the aims of life and the authentic needs of real people. In fact, all eventual changes in a system, changes we may observe here in their rudimentary forms, have come about, as it were, de facto, from below, because life compelled them to, not because they came from life, somehow directing it or forcing some change on it. Historical experience teaches us that any genuinely meaningful point of departure in an individual's life usually has an element of universality about it. In other words, it is not something partial, accessible only to a restricted community, and not transferable to any other. On the contrary, it must be potentially accessible to everyone. It must foreshadow a general solution, and thus it is not just the expression of an introverted, self-contained responsibility that individuals have to and for themselves alone, but responsibility to and for the world. Thus, it would be quite wrong to understand the parallel structures and the parallel polis as a retreat into a ghetto and as an act of isolation, addressing itself only to the welfare of those who had decided on such a course and who are indifferent to the rest. It would be wrong, in short, to consider it an essentially group solution that has nothing to do with the general situation. Such a concept would, from the start, alienate the notion of living within the truth from its proper point of departure, which is concern for others, transforming it ultimately into just another more sophisticated version of living within a lie. In doing so, of course, it would cease to be a genuine point of departure for individuals and groups and would recall the false notion of dissidence as an exclusive group with exclusive interests, carrying on their own exclusive dialogue with the powers that be. In any case, even the most highly developed forms of life in the parallel structures, even that most mature form of the parallel polis, can only exist, at least in post-totalitarian circumstances, when the individual is at the same time lodged in the first official structure by 1,000 different relationships, even though it may only be the fact that one buys what one needs in their stores, uses their money, and obeys their laws. Certainly, one can imagine life in its baser aspects flourishing in the parallel polis, but would not such a life, lived deliberately that way as a program, be merely another version of the schizophrenic life within a lie, which everyone else must live in one way or another? Would it not just be further evidence that a point of departure that is not a model solution, that is not applicable to others, cannot be meaningful as for an individual either? Patoka used to say that the most interesting thing about responsibility is that we carry it with us everywhere. That means that responsibility is ours, that we must accept it and grasp it here, now, in this place, in time and space where the Lord has set us down, and that we cannot lie our way out of it by moving somewhere else, whether it be to an Indian ashram or to a parallel polis. If Western young people so often discover that retreat to an Indian monastery fails them as an individual or group solution, then this is obviously because, and only because, it lacks that element of universality, since not everyone can retire to an ashram. Christianity is an example of an opposite way out. It is a point of departure for me here and now, but only because anyone, anywhere, at any time may avail themselves of it. In other words, the parallel polis points beyond itself and only makes sense as an act of deepening one's responsibility to and for the whole, as a way of discovering the most appropriate locus for this responsibility, not as an escape from it. This concludes part 6 at the end of reading chapter 18. See you next time.